Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Our lecture today is about the nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses. We will start with nasal cavity anatomy. The nasal cavity is a chamber consisting of bony walls covered with respiratory pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The cavity has a floor, roof, two lateral walls, and a midline partition or septum of bone and cartilage that divides the nasal cavity into right and left portions. Posteriorly, the nasal cavity communicates with the nasopharynx, which is the first part of the pharynx, through the posterior nasal apertures or conchae. The nasal cavity is about 6 to 7 centimeters in length anteroposteriorly and 2 centimeters in width inferiorly and 0.5 centimeters superiorly. Here, this picture will show you the nasal cavity proper. This is the nasal cavity, and it contains the superior nasal concha. هاي الطيات اللي نشوفها داخل التجويف الأنفي. 3 elevations للطيات: the superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. And here is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and this is the sphenoid bone containing this sphenoid sinus, and here is the hypophyseal fossa where the pituitary gland is sitting, and here is the nostril, the opening, external opening of the nose, which leads to this area, dilated area, which is called the vestibule. And this is the floor of the nasal cavity consisting of this bone, which is called the hard palate, anterior to it, and posteriorly we have also the soft palate. All this hard palate and part of the soft palate would form the floor of the nasal cavity and separate the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And this, of course, this is the olfactory bulb, which sit on the cribriform plate, receives the filaments, olfactory filaments from the mucosa of the roof of the nose, and this bulb leads to the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1. What are the functions of the nose and nasal cavity? The functions are, first of all, we have respiration. Second, olfaction. Third, filtration. Let's say filtration of the air. You may inspire and dirty air containing dust or something else, foreign bodies. Through this nose and nasal cavity, the air will be filtrated and it will be cleaned to be inspired as a clean air to the respiratory system, to the trachea and lungs. The fourth function is air condition of inspired air. Air condition of inspired air. Sometimes, as in cold weather, the inspired air is too cold, and this cold air, inspired air, will become warm. How? By passing through the conchae or over the conchae, which is covered by mucosa, and it will cause the warming of the cold inspired air. The other function is reception of secretions, إفرازات, from the paranasal air sinuses and nasolacrimal duct of the orbit. Now we talk about the relationships and boundaries of the nasal cavity. First of all, we talk about the relationships. What are the structures related surrounding the nasal cavity? On the medial side, posteriorly, and so on. First of all, the first relationship is the superior relationship. The nasal cavity is separated from the anterior cranial fossa above, by which structure is separated by the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Lying on the cribriform plates are the olfactory bulbs, which in turn receive filaments of the olfactory nerve from the mucosa of the roof of the nasal cavity. The lateral relationships, lateral to the upper half of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity is the ethmoid air sinus, and lateral to the ethmoid air sinus is the medial wall of the orbit. Lateral to the lower half of the lateral nasal wall is the maxillary air sinus. The inferior relationship below the floor of the nasal cavity is the oral cavity, and the hard palate forms a common partition separating the oral cavity below from the nasal cavity above. Now, the posterior relationship behind the nasal cavity and beyond the coni is the nasopharynx. The anterior relationship, the nostrils lead inward to dilated area termed the vestibule, دهليز, which lined by skin, and this skin contains contains hair in the lower part of the nose, the area which is called the vestibule, which is lined by the skin containing this hair of the nose. Now we talk about the boundaries of the nasal cavity. First of all, we talk about the floor. The floor of the nasal cavity is the hard palate. What is the floor of the nasal cavity? The floor of the nasal cavity is the hard palate. And the palatal processes of the maxilla contribute to the anterior 2/3, and the palatal process of the palatine bone contributes to the posterior third. The floor is convex in a mediolateral direction. Floor is convex in a mediolateral direction. Now, the roof of the nasal cavity, from anterior to posterior, the roof is formed by the nasal bones, the nasal spine of the frontal bone, and here the nasal spine of the frontal bone is a small bony projection from the anterior part, or from the midline of the anterior part of the frontal bone, just between the upper part of the nasal bones. The other bone is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and the anterior and inferior aspects of the body of the sphenoid bone. All these bones will form the roof of the nasal cavity. The lateral wall. The bony composition of the lateral wall is complicated. Why? Because it's composed of many bones, with many bones contributing in part. And these include, what are these bones that form the lateral wall? These includes the nasal bone, the maxilla, the ethmoid bone, the palatine bone, the sphenoid bone, and inferior concha. And inferior concha. Now we talk about the concha or the conchae. جمع concha, conchae. What are these conchae? The conchae are three elevations. How many? Three. Three elevations arise from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity as fragile. Fragile mean هشة. Scrolls of bones يعني مثل لفافة من العظمية covered by mucous membrane. The superior and middle conchae are medial extensions of the ethmoid bone. The superior and middle conchae are medial extensions of the ethmoid bone. The large inferior concha is a separate bone attached to the lateral wall. What do you mean by separate? Separate has no relation with other bones and is considered one of the facial bones. The meatuses. The meatuses are actually spaces, فسح, that lies below each conchae. Below each conchae, we have a space, and this space is called meatus. So, the meatuses, the space below each concha, is termed as meatus. Below the inferior concha is the inferior meatus. Below the middle concha is the middle meatus. And below the superior concha is the superior meatus. The space الفسحة above and behind the superior concha is called sphenoethmoidal recess. What's the meaning of recess? Recess means فجوة, فسحة أو فجوة. And why it is called sphenoethmoidal recess? Because it lies, this space or this recess lies between the sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone. And in this recess, in which the sphenoidal sinus opens into its posterior part. So in the posterior part of this sphenoethmoidal recess, the sphenoid sinus will open this part of the sphenoethmoidal recess. I will show you later on in a picture this area and where the sphenoid sinus open. The superior meatus, which is a narrow fissure, and the posterior ethmoidal cells open into its anterior-superior part by one or more orifices. The middle meatus, which lie below the middle concha, it is much longer and deeper, than the superior meatus. The anterior-superior part of this meatus leads into a funnel-shaped opening known as the infundibulum, قمعية الشكل, which leads to the frontal sinus. On the lateral wall of the middle meatus is a deep curved groove which begins behind the infundibulum and runs posterior-inferiorly. This is known as the hiatus semilunaris. I will show you in the picture, in this picture. So, well, this is the lateral view. Here is the superior concha removed to show you the area or the superior meatus. So from here to here, this part is removed, superior concha. And here, the middle concha, and this part from here to here, or this area, has been removed to show you of this area of concha removed to show you the middle meatus. And also here we have the inferior meatus, and this part from here to here also removed to show you the opening of the nasolacrimal gland. Duct, sorry. Here, the superior concha removed. This area here, in this area, this is called the sphenoethmoidal recess. This is the sphenoid bone, the sphenoid sinus, body of sphenoid bone, containing the sphenoid sinus, and this is the cribriform plate of ethmoid. So this area here, between the sphenoid bone and the cribriform plate, is called sphenoethmoidal recess. And in this recess, there is the opening of the sphenoid air sinus. So this is the opening in this recess of the sphenoid air sinus. Okay? And in the superior meatus, we have the opening of posterior ethmoidal here, where is, yes, here we have the posterior ethmoidal cells. Here it will open in the superior meatus. This opening and this opening are the opening of the posterior ethmoidal cells. Posterior ethmoidal cells. Where? Posterior ethmoidal cells in the superior meatus. Okay? Now, in the middle, as we said, in the middle meatus, it is much longer and deeper than the superficial meatus. And the anterior superior part of this meatus leads into a funnel-shaped opening known as the infundibulum. Here is the infundibulum. And where is the infundibulum? Yes. Funnel-shaped, the infundibulum. This is the infundibulum here, actually. This is the infundibulum. And in this infundibulum, the frontal sinus, this is the frontal sinus, it has an opening into the infundibulum that lies in the middle meatus. On the lateral wall of the medial meatus, this is the groove. This groove is called deep groove, passed curvedly, is called the hiatus semilunaris. This is the hiatus semilunaris. Okay? And the anterior ethmoidal and maxillary sinuses open into this hiatus semilunaris. The anterior ethmoidal and maxillary sinuses open into it. Okay? Yes. The opening of the maxillary sinus lies in the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. The opening of the maxillary in the posterior part of the hiatus semilunaris. The upper margin of the hiatus semilunaris is formed by a prominent bulge. This is a prominent bulge. And upper margin of the hiatus semilunaris is formed by a prominent bulge known as, what is the name of this bulge? Polyethmoidalis, on which is the opening of the middle ethmoidal cells. Now we have the inferior meatus, which is below the inferior conchae. Here, the nasolacrimal duct opens into the anterior part of this meatus, close to the attached border of the inferior concha. And these pictures show you the superior concha and below it the superior meatus and the middle concha with the middle meatus and the inferior concha and the meatus, and this is the hard palate here separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And also another picture shows the superior concha, middle concha, inferior concha, and superior meatus, middle meatus, and this is anterior view of the nasal cavity, the lateral view. Okay. Now we talk about another structure within the cranial cavity, or that separate the cranial cavity into right and left, and this structure is called the nasal septum, العربي الحاجز الأنفي. You see this picture show you the parts of this nasal septum consist of part of bones and cartilage, and the bones, two bones form the nasal septum, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and the bone vomer, you know vomer. These two bones, in addition to the cartilage, septal cartilage, would form, all of them will form this nasal septum that separate or that divide the cavity into right and left nasal cavities. So the septum of the nose divides the nasal cavity into right and left portions, and these portions are generally unequal. So the septum deviates to one side or the other. The septum is formed by the following elements, which are covered with nasal mucosa. Covered with ايش? With nasal mucosa. First of all, we have the septal cartilage, which represents the movable portion of the septum, and it is not seen in the dried skull. Second, the vertical plate of the ethmoid bone. It forms the anterior-superior portion of the bony septum. Anterior-superior portion of the bony septum. The third part, or the third constituent of the nasal septum, is the vomer. It forms the posterior-inferior portion of the bony septum. Now we talk about the nerve supply of the nasal cavity. This picture shows you some of the nerve of the nasal cavity. We have here, this one is the anterior ethmoidal nerve. Anterior ethmoidal nerve. And here we have the posterior ethmoidal branch. And here we have the septal nerve. And also we have the nasopalatine and the greater palatine nerve. And here we have the external nasal nerve supplying the skin of the nose. So, the nerve supply of the nerve can be divided into general sensation and special sensation and autonomic sensation. Starting with general sensation, the general sensation of the nasal cavity is through, first, we have the anterior ethmoidal nerve. Anterior ethmoidal nerve arises from the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic nerve within the orbit. You know, the ophthalmic nerve is the first division, or what's called V1 of trigeminal nerve. It passes medially through the anterior ethmoidal canal of the orbit wall to supply the anterior ethmoidal air cells then it continues medially to enter the anterior cranial fossa briefly, and then exit through the ethmoidal canal anterior to the cribriform plate. The canal leads to the roof of the nasal cavity, and here the nerve divides into internal branches, pass to the lateral nasal wall and septum, and external nasal branches continue downward on the internal aspect of the nasal bone to exit into the external nose as the external nasal nerve. The second nerve is the nasal branch of the infraorbital nerve. If you remember, when we talk about the terminal branch of maxillary nerve, when it leaves the cranium, it leaves through the infraorbital opening as infraorbital nerve. This is the terminal branch of maxillary nerve. And once it leaves the infraorbital foramen, it divides into three branches: the palpebral branch, the nasal branch, and the labial branch. Here we will talk about the nasal branch of the infraorbital nerve, which supplies the skin of the ala of the nose. And you know the ala of the nose is the movable part of the nostril of the nose. The third nerve is the nasal branch of anterior superior alveolar nerve, which is also a branch of the maxillary nerve. As the anterior superior alveolar nerve descends in its canal wall of the maxillary sinus, it gives off an internal nasal branch which passes to the nasal cavity just below the inferior concha. It supplies the mucosa of the anterior portion of the inferior meatus. So the nasal branch of anterior superior alveolar nerve supplies the anterior portion of the inferior meatus. The fourth nerve is the superior lateral nasal nerve. Superior lateral nasal nerve, also it is called short sphenopalatine nerves. And these arise from the pterygopalatine ganglion and pass medially through the sphenopalatine foramen. If you remember, this foramen in the sphenopalatine fossa. Remember it? Through this foramen, the short sphenopalatine nerves pass to supply the posterior two-thirds of the lateral nasal wall. The infero-posterior lateral nasal branch arises from the greater palatine branch of the pterygopalatine ganglion as it descends in its canal. The branches leave the canal to supply the inferior lateral aspect of the nasal wall. The fifth branch, the general sensation, is called the nasopalatine nerve. All of you remember this nerve. Nasopalatine nerve also is called long sphenopalatine nerve. This nerve arises from the pterygopalatine ganglia and passes medially through the sphenopalatine foramen to the nasal cavity. It continues medially and then directed downward and anteriorly along the nasal septum to supply it. So it supplies the nasal septum. It ends by passing through the incisive canal to the oral cavity below, where it is sensory to the oral mucosa of the anterior aspect of the hard palate. So these 5 nerves are involved in the general sensation, and as we said previously, What I mean by general sensation means pain, temperature, vibration. Now we talk about special sensation, which is smell, olfaction. The olfactory mucosa contains bipolar olfactory cells. The peripheral processes pass to the mucosa as hair-like smell receptor endings, while the central process pass upward in a form of bundles of filaments which pass through the cribriform plate and end in the olfactory bulbs. And of course, from the olfactory bulbs to the olfactory nerve to the brain. The third part of the nerve supply of the nasal cavity is the autonomic nerve supply. And this includes the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve supply to the glands. Autonomic nerve supply, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve supply to the glands of the nasal mucosa arise from postganglionic fibers of the ciliary ganglion, traveling with the anterior ethmoidal nerve, and from postganglionic fibers of the pterygopalatine traveling with the posterolateral nasal and nasopalatine nerves. Now we talk about the blood supply of the nasal cavity. First of all, we have the arteries, and here in this picture show you the main arteries that supply the nasal cavity, nasal septum, and nasal walls. We have the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries. Here's the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries. We have the sphenopalatine artery, the sphenopalatine artery. And also we have the greater palatine artery and the superior labial artery. Superior labial artery was called septal branch. This is from the facial nerve, of course. And you see all these branches, 4 branches, are anastomosed freely in this area, which is called the Little's area, or sometimes it's called Kesselbach area. Here is Kesselbach area. At this area, when you have epistaxis, الرعاف, the bleeding usually occurs from this area. In case of epistaxis, the bleeding occurs, and it's sometimes heavy bleeding. Why? Because this area is supplied by many branches or many arteries, and anastomosis of many arteries in this area. So any trauma or any dryness of the nose, any cause of the epistaxis will cause disease of this area, of this mucosal area, and it leads to bleeding, which may be sometimes severe. Also in case of hypertension, sometimes when the blood pressure becomes very high, this area, because the mucosa is very thin and these friable vessels, and because of high blood pressure, sometimes this will rupture and cause epistaxis. So the arterial supply of the septum and nasal cavity, the mucosa of the nasal cavity receives a rich blood supply from several sources that anastomose freely. The most important and largest arteries are the anterior ethmoidal branch of the ophthalmic and the sphenopalatine branch of the maxillary artery. As you know, the ophthalmic artery is a branch of the internal carotid artery, and the maxillary artery branch of external carotid artery. In addition to the anterior ethmoidal branch and the sphenopalatine branch, also we have a small nasal branch from the facial and infraorbital arteries. The veins. The venous retin collects as a plexus from which veins drain to ophthalmic veins, to pterygoid plexus, facial vein, and infraorbital veins. That's all about the nasal cavity, and now we talk about the paranasal sinuses, الجيوب الأنفية. Why it's called para? Because it's howling nose. The sinus develops as outpouching of the embryonic nasal cavity, and with increasing age, the cavities expand into the adjacent bones. They are bilateral structures with unequal size and lined by a continuation of nasal mucosa, which is ciliated columnar epithelium. What's the function of these paranasal sinuses? They cause lighting of the bones. Well, the skull weight would decrease by the presence of these sinuses. So it lightens the bone. Second, it would cause resonance to the voice. Our voice now when we talk, this special sounds which when we talk, the sound would be changed by and give resonance by the effect of these paranasal sinuses. And also is cleaning the nasal passage by secreting fluid. So there is slight mucus secretion from these paranasal sinuses to the nasal cavity. So it will clean the nasal passage. This secretion cleans the nasal passage. We have four sinuses. We have the maxillary sinus, we have the ethmoid, the frontal sinus, and the ethmoid sinus, and the sphenoid sinuses. We take each one and we give you some notes on each of these sinuses. First of all, we have the maxillary sinus, which is also called the antrum, and this sinus occupies the maxilla. It is within the body of the maxilla. This is the sinus within the maxilla. And these are the picture after opening or removal of the facial plate of the maxilla. We see this is the cavity within the maxilla, and this cavity is the maxillary sinus. This is also a CT scan showing this space within the maxilla of the sinus, which is called the maxillary sinus. And of course, this is the nasal cavity. Okay. So the maxillary sinus occupies the body of the maxillary bone, and it may extend into the zygomatic bone. It may extend into the zygomatic bone. This is the zygomatic bone, and this is the maxilla. This maxillary sinus may extend partly within the zygomatic bone. Not always. Sometimes may extend here. The roof is separated from the orbital cavity by the plate of maxilla. This is the plate of maxilla. This is the plate of maxilla. This is the plate of maxilla, separated from the orbital cavity. The floor is closely related to the apices of molar teeth or premolar. And it is very clear. This is the molar teeth and this is the premolar. So the floor is in close relation. This is very important, of course, when you, in the future, when you do tooth implantation, it's very important to take care not to enter the maxillary sinus. Here is very in close relation. The apices of the molar and the premolar teeth are in close relation with the floor of the maxillary sinus. So it's very important to know this part of the floor of this sinus. The sinus is about What are the dimensions of the sinus? The sinus is about 35 millimeters width, about 3.5 centimeters in width. This width here. 30 millimeter length, 30 meter length, and 35 millimeter height. Okay, 3 dimension, 35 millimeter width, 30 meter length, and 35 meter height. The anterior wall is bounded by the facial surface of maxilla, while the posterior wall is related to the pterygopalatine fossa. The medial wall is bounded by the nasal surface of the body of maxilla and by parts of the palatine, lacrimal, and ethmoid bones. What is the arterial supply of the maxillary sinus? The maxillary sinus is supplied by the infraorbital artery and posterior superior alveolar artery. And these two branches are branched from the maxillary artery. The nerve supply is through the posterior, middle, and anterior superior alveolar nerves, which are branches of the maxillary nerves, V2 of trigeminal nerve. And also the infraorbital nerve. Now we talk about the other sinus, which is the frontal sinus. Frontal sinus, الجيب الجبهوي. This is the frontal sinus. This is the frontal sinus. And this is the forehead. And this area is the supraorbital area. Okay? Now, these occupy the frontal bone above the superior orbital margin. They extend upwards in the forehead region and backwards in the roof of the orbital cavity. To a different degree, each sinus is separated from its snapper by a septum, which is usually oblique. The arterial supply is through supraorbital and anterior ethmoidal arteries. The nerve supply is through the supraorbital nerve. The third paranasal sinus is the ethmoidal sinus. And here you see this is the ethmoidal sinus within the ethmoid bone. Actually, it consists of multiple cavities. This is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Multiple cavities within the body or within the ethmoid bone, and these are called ethmoidal sinuses, and so it's called ethmoidal sinuses. The ethmoidal sinuses are a group of small cavities or L cell lying within the facial part of the ethmoid bone, and they are closely related to the medial wall of the orbital cavity and the floor of the anterior cranial fossa on either side of the cribriform plate. They are divided into 3 groups, the anterior, middle, and posterior groups. So these are called the ethmoidal sinuses or sinuses or cells, air cells. The arterial supply is through the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries from the ophthalmic artery, that's say from internal carotid system, as well as by the sphenopalatine artery from the terminal branch of the internal maxillary artery, that's from the external carotid system. So it is supplied, the ethmoidal air sinuses supplied by 2 systems from the internal carotid artery through the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries and through the external artery or external carotid artery system through the maxillary artery. Through the sphenopalatine artery, which is a terminal branch of the internal maxillary artery. Actually, internal maxillary artery, sometimes there's a maxillary artery without internal maxillary artery. The nerve supply of the ethmoidal artery, ethmoidal sinus, is through the ethmoidal branch of the ophthalmic nerve. Now, lastly, we have the sphenoid sinuses, and here the clear. This is the sphenoid sinus within the body of the sphenoid bone, and here we have the pituitary gland, pituitary fossa, hypophyseal fossa. Okay, and here's a CT scan showing the sphenoid sinus, and this foramen is foramen rotundum. It looks like this in the CT scan. And also we have the optic canal also seen in this view. So you see, this is within the body of the sphenoid. Within the body of the sphenoid bone. These occupy the body of a sphenoid bone and may extend for some distance into the greater wing. They are bilateral but vary in size, and the septum between the sinus is usually asymmetrical. The arterial supply is through the sphenopalatine artery. The nerve supply is through the ethmoidal branch of the ophthalmic nerve. And thank you very much.